Episode 6: The Birth of Iron. The siege left marks that light could not heal. In the weeks after the Great Armadas passed, the solar system turned itself to the task of counting what could never be fully counted. Numbers were broadcast because numbers could be born where images could not. Bulwarks fallen and bulwarks dim but recoverable. Ironclads that would sail again after months under scaffolds. Hammerfalls tallied by fractions, 2/3 of a squadron limping in, a quarter of another stitched together out of survivors. Aegis clouds regenerated in factories that ran so hot their shadows were violet. And then the numbers that did not belong to ships. Names scrolled in narrow columns through every public hall, every market, every mess line. Families learned to stand together and read together and breathe together, and when they came to the end of a column, a new column began. Grief became a practice, and then a discipline, a way of holding shape while the air moved through a chest that had learned new hollows. Earth took inventory of the sky. Broken rings of debris glittered like frost around the planet, not elegant, like the bands of Saturn, but coarse, serrated, shrapnel of the age that had ended. To look up at night from the great continents was to see a new constellation of wreckage, each point a story told in a voice that would not answer any more. Cities dimmed themselves at curfew hour so power could climb the elevators that must not fail. Coolant towers that kept the bulwark fields hot. Manufacturing terraces where hulls were pressed into the shapes that held off vacuum. The long red arteries that fed the shipyards above the equator, where heat was a language and sparks fell like rain. Earth learned to sleep with the lights low and the factories loud. Mars lived, which was more than anyone had promised. The shipyards that had once built the Eclipse were now devoted to the less miraculous work of gives and repairs. Ribs for ironclads, spinal conduits for hammerfalls, entire noses of Aegis frigates poured, cooled, machined, and mated to bodies like grafts in an operating theater the size of a small nation. The deserts turned to glass where lances had kissed them. The cities wore bandages of temporary domework patched like quilts across broken panels. The planet spoke in a hoarse voice made of pump hum and weld hiss and the steady thud of mass drivers returning to cadence. When the storms came, as Mars storms always do, they carried dust with a metallic taste. Children learned the smell of steel in the wind and called it weather. The belt mourned by working. Ceres and Vesta and Pallas turned their hollows into foundries. On smaller rocks without names, crews with numbers instead of flags, dug by hand because the machines had been melted down for armor. Or moved in convoys guarded by frigates that looked like they remembered being freighters, because they did. The convoys came home thin and left again thinner. Asteroid families invented superstitions the way humans always have, when the math is clear and the future is not. Touch the threshold, count to 8, spit in your palm, murmur the name of an ironclad as you cycle the lock. The rituals did not change outcomes, but they gave the hands something to do other than tremble. The Terran Accord announced a week of silence, and then immediately amended it to a day. The day was held everywhere at once, synchronized to a tone that had once marked the beginning of celebration seasons. No engines fired, no messages moved except those already in flight. Bulwarks stood at half power, wrapped in their own quiet. The Eclipse drifted, scaffolded, unlit, save the safety beacons that blinked like a sleeper's pulse. Humanity did nothing, deliberately, and the shape of that stillness taught it more than speeches had managed to do during the centuries of peace. After the day, The tone sounded again, and everything that had been paused resumed with the conviction of a vow kept. From that day forward, ceremony wore coveralls. Memorials were held on loading docks and in machine bays, under the ribs of half-built hulls, beside the coolant lines that sweated in the damp breath of the living. Names were read over the noise instead of against silence, one voice rising and falling, while presses cycled, while cranes swung, while bolters stuttered their patient stitch. When the voice was finished, the work did not pause to applaud. It grew steadier. It was how a civilization learned to remember without stopping. The Accords councils, once elegant theatres of negotiation and most recently hardened rooms of logistics, redefined what it meant to rule. The old ministries rearranged themselves into fewer, heavier bodies: allocation, defense, continuity. Allocation rationed even abstractions. Defense published losses before victories. Continuity was a new word and an old dream, the promise that human life would have a later. Its charter was short. Food must move, power must flow, children must learn. Under its seal, schools reopened to halls that smelled of metal and disinfectant. Teachers revised lessons to include the geometry of shields and the history of mistakes, and the oldest subjects were given back their teeth. Language classes taught the words that must be said quickly when alarms sound. Mathematics drilled the habits that build formations and balance scarcity. Music metronomed itself to the charge cycle of a bulwark capacitor so that no ear would forget the timing of survival. Markets changed, but they did not vanish. People traded in things that fit into pockets: salvaged fuses, sharp screws, folded squares of ration foil that could be repressed into gaskets if one were clever. There was laughter, because there must be. Jokes gestured toward the war and then away from it with a deftness that learned itself in a hurry. Couples held hands as if hands were anchor lines. Weddings fanned out across shift changes in 5-minute ceremonies officiated by whoever carried the right stamp that day. The vows were offered quickly and meant deeply, and then the newly married reported to their posts slightly taller than they had been an hour ago. Art did not retreat to basements. It found new canvas. Hull plating that had passed inspection received murals in the hours before mounting. A procession of bulwarks like mountains under stars, the clean line of an ironclad's wake, an Aegis cloud, painted as birds, as fish, as clouds again. The eclipse, always the eclipse, rendered as a wound and as a halo and as a shadow crossing a too bright sky. Painters invented pigments that would adhere even under the shearing of vacuum. Sculptors rehearsed in scrap and then welded their pieces into the bones of platforms, where no one would see them unless a panel came away. And if a panel came away, the person who saw them would need to see them badly. Poets accepted that the new metaphors were rails and shields and tubes. They made them sing anyway. Religion did not dissolve. It recalibrated. Priests blessed coolant and consecrated rivet guns. Mosques and temples and churches and rooms that had never had names turned their windows toward the shipyards like faithful orienting themselves to a holy place. Sermons grew shorter and more specific. The refrain was not triumph, but endurance. Not that God or gods or the great unnameable had given victory, but that the breath in a chest was gift enough to deserve work. A priest of no particular tradition burned her old homilies and swore the ash into paste and marked the forehead of every worker who asked with a dark line that looked like a weld. On the tactical boards where the war had been recorded in a language of light, a new kind of map spread in green, corridors of reliability. These were not routes to attack or retreat, but arteries along which energy and food and spares could move with predictability now that the storm had passed. Each corridor had thickness, margin for error, redundancy enough to survive an accident or a raid or a mistake. Continuity measured itself in corridor thickness the way the Utopia had once measured itself in parks per citizen. The thicker the lines, the longer the later. The Eclipse did not sleep. It dreamed with its hull open. Scaffolds swung across its flank, like vines along a cliff. Patches went on in plates the size of plazas, some temporary, some made of better metal than the ship had worn the day it first fired. Technicians who had survived the battle learned to walk along its curvature as if walking the inside of a bell, their tools scribing notes into the air that rang faintly in the bones if one stood near enough. In the cavern that housed the lance assembly, crews worked by touch and gauge because instruments that could be trusted for this job did not yet exist. The weapon had exceeded expectations and models and doctrine. Now the expectations and models and doctrine must expand until they could fit around it without tearing. The ship's log, once sparse, thickened with test pulses tuned to amplitudes so low they barely warmed the coil housings, and with the careful returns of shield harmonics, and with the notes of 1,000 small fixes, a bracket that would not stay true at temperature, a cable harness that had to be redressed so it would not whip under surge and cut a man in half. The decision that no one signed, but everyone obeyed was simple. The Eclipse would not be risked without meaning. Meaning no longer meant spectacle. It meant the difference between corridor thickness increasing or decreasing. People learned to think that way, and the flagship abided by it. The galaxy, beyond Sul, did not send flowers. Some neighbors dimmed their transmissions further, as if fear could be made smaller by turning down the volume. Others listened more closely and wrote longer reports that never left their archives. A few sent probes toward the edges of the system, not to help or to threaten, but to look. The Accord did not shoot them. It did not wave. It watched them pass and told itself that curiosity was better than contempt. And the Elythians, those saints made of knives, those guardians remade as executioners, were not gone. Patrols at the far edges of human reach reported sightings like old sailors' tales, not full fleets that bled the sky white, but task groups moving with the care of animals that have learned a trap, scouts in pairs instead of swarms, carriers that dumped drones into nothing and then swallowed them again, as if practicing for a rehearsal. Skirmishes pricked the map like spider bites. Sometimes the bites came in clusters that made the skin feverish, and then they ceased. The pattern itself became a subject in the academies. Had the enemy lost appetite or discovered a new one? Did caution mean weakness or craft? The Accord strategists drew lines on translucent overlays and slid them across the old plans until certain geometries refused to be ignored. The Elythians had not abandoned their taste for inevitability. They had simply decided not to feed it with haste. Their vectors described patience. They did not seek the corridors. They charted around them. They did not challenge the bulwark lattice. They tested the spaces between nodes on nights when no one expected visitors. It felt, to those whose business it was to feel such things, like the pressure of a storm that had decided to regather itself beyond the horizon. Not because it had been broken, but because it had more to say. Continuity responded the way it always did, by thickening lines. New bulwarks were towed to positions that made mathematicians smile. Ironclad refits were prioritized not by glory, but by where they would increase system reliability per unit of reactor hour. Aegis production schedules were published alongside bread delivery timetables because they now belonged to the same category. The list of things that must arrive. Hammerfall doctrine was updated with experiments in restraint. It turned out that teaching a ship built to sprint how to wait was harder than teaching it where to run. The training programs adjusted. Anything that could become a habit was written into muscle. When the first real sign came, it came as absence. Sectors of space that had glittered with Elythian scouts like frost at morning showed nothing for 3 days, then 5, then 9. The farthest listening posts heard echoes of engine notes fading outward. Relays that had learned the taste of enemy comms reported empty bands where the static should have had a flavor. The data was presented in graphs first, because graphs are easier to distrust than words. And then words were said aloud. They are leaving. No one cheered. Departure in war is a feint until it isn't. The Accord kept the lattice tight and the bulwarks warm. Patrols followed on leashes of caution, never far enough that a trap could close behind them, always near enough that the enemy would know they were seen. The first week of withdrawal looked like a gift. The second looked like a test. By the third, even the reluctant conceded the pattern. The Elythians were emptying the board inside human reach. The withdrawal revealed bones in the dark that no one had seen under the pressure of survival. Enemy relay stones hidden in dust. Hollowed rocks that had hummed with quiet purpose and now hummed no more. The ghosts of paths that had carried coordination silently through volumes the Accord had called empty. Salvage crews moved like archivists through rooms recently vacated by gods. They took what could be taken. They photographed what could not. They learned. It is an old human habit to build new thinking atop the ruins of an old enemy's certainty. Above Mars, the Eclipse shone again, not brightly, but with the competent glow of systems that have been persuaded back into chorus. Its scar was not polished away. The shipyards left that long, dark seam visible along the starboard flank, because a lesson that is made invisible is a lesson that will need to be learned again. Test pulses climbed the lance assembly's throat and fell back like restrained breath. Shield planes unfolded and folded, showing their timing to bulwark cores that answered with their own rhythm until both rhythms reconciled. A transmitter the size of a tower blinked green, then amber, then green again. The flagship did not strut. It lay in wait like a tool that knows its job. In the halls where continuity posted its dockets, a new line appeared beneath food and power and lessons, migration windows. Families whose homes had been scraped away by lances were assigned new orbits, new domes, new corridors to trust with their groceries and their sleep. The windows were narrow because ships were few and hulls were needed elsewhere. Still, the lists grew longer every day. People moved as if they had always intended to. They arranged their lives in smaller boxes. They labeled those boxes with handwriting that improved as it went, and they stepped aboard transports that smelled of primer and hope and went where they were sent. A civilization is a choreography. The Accord danced it with sore feet. Only after the third week of outward silence did the counselors allow the word that had been sitting in their mouths like a hot stone to be cooled and spoken. Reprieve. It was not a pardon. It was not a peace. It was a weather break in which roofs could be tarped and fields reseeded and the bones of ships laid into jigs. The message that followed the word was simple. Use it. Since the betrayal, the Accord had learned not to gild orders with reasons. People understood. The Accord shadowed them at the edge of range. Frigates on quivering tethers destroyers in leashed packs, cruisers holding a distance calculated to keep pride unpricked. The Eclipse took station behind the tail of an ironclad line and turned its face toward the dark where the enemy was going. It did not fire, it did not hail, it watched with the stillness of a statue that remembers being a blade. Across Earth and Mars and the Belt, broadcasts broke into labor with the update that could not be kept private. The last of them are leaving. Workshops did not stop. People spoke the sentence aloud to one another because a sentence must be shared to finish being spoken. They waited for the sky to argue. The sky did not argue. It listened. It stretched. It began, almost imperceptibly, to be large again. No one saw the message coming because no one had ever seen a message at all. The silence after the retreat did not feel like victory. It felt like standing in the hollow left by an avalanche, the air still thick with powder, the mountain unreadable above. Humanity had endured, but endurance without transformation was only waiting to be buried again. The Terran Accord understood this in its bones, and so the word resistance was set aside. What came next was not resistance. It was rebirth. The phrase appeared first on a scrap of metal welded to the flank of an ironclad. The birth of iron. It spread faster than decrees, because it was truer than policy. Within days it was painted on factory walls, etched into ration chits, scratched by knives into the backs of helmets. Iron was the metaphor that fit. A thing soft until tested by fire, a thing hammered into shape by force, a thing that carried its scars as strength. Humanity was no longer the accord of peace. It was the accord of iron. The councils formalized what the people had already named. Doctrine became constitution. The tripart ministries, allocation, defense, continuity, wrote their charters into permanent law. Education restructured itself around a single sentence. Every citizen is a node in the lattice. Science lost its last division between civilian and military. Research into agriculture meant ration extensions for soldiers. Research into energy meant thicker bulwark corridors. Research into medicine meant field kits that could keep a pilot alive long enough to fire once more. Even the arts aligned themselves. Painters taught apprentices how to stencil fleet insignia on armor. Musicians composed marches to match hammerfall thrust cycles. Poets turned their verses into briefings that could be memorized in 30 seconds before a launch. Yet even alloy bends under questions. As weeks became months, and Elythian fleets continued their steady outward retreat, the unspoken unease deepened. Humanity's scouts shadowed them always, close enough to taste the ion wakes of their engines. But no ambush came, no sudden return. Only precision withdrawal, executed with a discipline so exact that even human admirals, who had learned respect for the enemy the hard way, whispered of reverence. What unsettled the Accord most was what the Elythians left behind. Hidden lattice stations embedded in asteroids, silent when approached, their interiors burned out as if deliberately sterilized. Communications relays, their crystalline cores still humming faintly with power, but empty of the data streams that had once passed through them. Scattered drones floating without orders, their sharp edges dulled, their programming blank. The enemy had not fled in chaos. They had cleaned as they withdrew, erasing fingerprints, folding maps, leaving no clue that was not deliberate. The academies of continuity puzzled over the pattern. Some argued it was the efficiency of predators who had found more fruitful prey elsewhere. Others insisted it was the caution of an enemy planning a larger strike beyond human sight. A few, quieter, wondered if it was theater, a performance of retreat designed to teach humanity to think of itself as strong. The councils dismissed speculation. They ordered thicker corridors, more ships, new bulwarks. If the enemy wanted humans to think themselves strong, humanity would oblige by becoming stronger still. And yet, in the shadows of the shipyards and the silence of the repair decks, the question lingered. Why would an enemy that had shown no hesitation in slaughter, no pause in betrayal, choose to leave when the prey was bloodied and vulnerable? Why not finish the work? The answer did not arrive. Instead, the retreat continued, week after week, until the last of the great crystalline fleets hovered at the rim of Sul, its hulls refracting light in silence, poised like a blade considering whether to cut. The Eclipse watched them. Its lance had been tested, cooled, rebuilt, and tested again. Its shields now pulsed with rhythms borrowed from bulwark fields, tighter and steadier than before. Its hull bore the great scar left by the siege, a black seam that the shipyards had refused to polish away. To human eyes, it looked less like a flaw and more like a banner. When the last of the Elythian fleets prepared to burn outward into the void, humanity's lattice stood braced, waiting. Aegis clouds hung thick in protective skeins. Hammerfalls crouched in ambush positions. Ironclads arrayed like a wall, bulwarks blazing. The Eclipse loomed at the center, silent, its lance charged. No one moved, no one fired. All of humanity seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable treachery, the sudden turn, the knives drawn in farewell. But the knives did not fall. Instead, something impossible happened. For the first time since the betrayal, a channel opened. The channel opened without request, without handshake, without preamble. Across the solar system, every receiver lit at once. On Earth, in the humming factories. On Mars, in the domes patched with welded scars. In the belt, among convoys straining under their cargoes. Aboard the Eclipse itself, where crews froze with tools in hand, the same signal arrived. It did not flicker or stutter. It was not distorted by static. It was perfect, like a blade laid flat across the throat of silence. The voice was not human. It was not even close. It was crystalline, faceted, as if many tones spoke at once, aligned into one chord. It carried no emotion, no inflection. It was the sound of inevitability, given language. Congratulations. You have passed the test. Nothing followed, no explanation, no terms, no demands. The channel snapped closed, and the last Elythian fleets turned away, their engines burning in pale symmetry as they vanished into the dark between stars. The silence that followed was greater than the siege itself. On Earth, workers dropped their tools and stared at the air as if sound could be touched. On Mars, evacuation sirens fell silent for the first time in months, and families whispered the words again and again, trying to bend them into meaning. In the belt, hardened crews who had faced death without flinching found themselves trembling at 3 sentences that answered nothing. On the Eclipse's bridge, officers traded looks, heavy with dread and awe. The ship's commander did not record a reply. There was nothing to reply to. The accord convened within the hour. Councils that had argued over every bolt and ration now found themselves with no words. Ministers read the message aloud, as if repetition might summon context. Allocation demanded interpretation. Was the war over? Continuity demanded caution. Was it only a pause? Defense demanded preparation. Was this the beginning of something worse? No answer could be found, because the words were not a conversation. They were a verdict, And so the Accord turned to what it understood. It rebuilt. Shipyards continued their endless rhythm, pounding steel and alloy into hulls. Bulwarks were reinforced. Ironclads were berthed in new numbers. Aegis clouds thickened. Hammerfall squadrons honed tactics against simulacra of an enemy that might never return. The Eclipse drifted above Mars, a scarred giant undergoing constant repair. Its great lance kept warm in case the sky tested it again. But something deeper had shifted. Humanity's utopia was not sleeping, waiting to wake. It was gone, burned away. The Peacekeeper's civilization had been hammered into iron. The words of the Elythians did not soothe. They hardened. If the war had been a test, then humanity had been a student, forged through torment, its lessons written in blood. And if this was graduation, then it was into a universe where survival itself was examination, unending. Culture wrapped itself around the revelation. Artists painted the message onto the hulls of ships, the letters carved into steel. Priests recited it as a dark psalm, warning their flocks that tests do not end, only change. Teachers used it as the opening line in lessons, reminding students that existence itself demanded proof. The phrase became a scar carried collectively, not victory, not relief, but a vow to never again be soft enough to need such testing. And in every corridor, every dome, every habitat where humanity gathered, one truth settled like sediment. Whether the Elythians had been predators or examiners, guardians or executioners, it no longer mattered. The test had been survived, and survival had transformed the species into something it had never been before. Above Mars, the Eclipse hung in shadow, its scar visible against the stars, its lance quiet but waiting. Shipyards swarmed around it like bees around a wounded queen, patching, strengthening, whispering prayers. It no longer looked like salvation. It looked like destiny, an iron monument to what humanity had become. The age of peace was ash. The age of resistance was past. What remained was the age humanity had named for itself, the birth of iron. And the galaxy, watching, knew that whatever test had been given, its result would echo far beyond Sol. For Earth had passed, and in passing had ceased to be what it once was. It had become iron,